1945, September was the year and the month of my birth. I was born in northeastern Alberta, and I grew up in northeastern Alberta, and I remained in the community of Bonnyville till I graduated from high school in 1963, then went to university, and then started to make my way in the world. I recall this very clearly. I was in grade 8, and the teacher of the day, a nun, asked the question, so what do you all want to be when you grow up? Now remember, we're looking at 1953, and in 1953 there were pretty limited opportunities for anybody living in Western Canada, but more importantly for anybody living in rural Western Canada. There was no NAIT, there was no SAIT, there were no colleges, there was the University of Alberta, yes, but there wasn't even a University of Calgary, as I recall. When you ask the question, what is it you want to be? Boys would normally say, I want to be a farmer like my dad, I want to be a carpenter like my dad, I want to be a fireman, if you had a fire department. We didn't have one in Bonnyville other than the volunteer one. The girls basically said they wanted to be moms, or they wanted to be hairdressers and that sort of thing. But I somehow said I wanted to become an elected person, and I remember the teacher stopping and looking at me. And she said, what does that mean? I said, well, we have coming to our community now one radio station, CBC out of Edmonton, and then a few years later, CKSA out of Lloydminster. So you were being connected to the world in a way that you had not been before. And I had heard of people like Premier Ernest Manning in the province of Alberta, and Prime Minister John Diefenbaker at another date. And I said, these are pretty fascinating people. What do? They go around talking to people, they make decisions, they're leaders in government. I think that's a neat idea. I think that's a neat thing to do. At the same time as I grew older, my father was in business in downtown Bonnyville. And the politicals would come and see him. The members of the Alberta Legislative Assembly were all our neighbors, or businessmen, or tradesmen across the road kind of thing, people you knew. And the Member of Parliament would come and visit periodically. And I got to know them, I got to say hello to them. And as I grew older, they became more fascinating to me. And yes, I wanted to become an elected person. When I was in high school, I did run for Students' Union president when I was in grade 11, but the grade 12s would have no part of electing somebody who was in grade 11, and the grade 10s weren't interested, so the grade 11 candidate got defeated, and defeated badly. So, okay, fine. Years go by. In 1974, I was in Barrhead, Alberta, teaching. The last day of the 5th year, I had made a vow to myself before that time, that I would do something different every 5 years. So this is the last day of the 5th year, and I got up and I told my wife, well, I'm going to see the superintendent. I've written him a letter, I'm going to resign. We'd already talked about it, her and I. And she said, well, are you really serious about doing this? I said, yes, okay. And she said, fine, so we're really going to go? Yes, we are. Well, where are we going to go? We're going to go to Greece, and I'm going to write a spy thriller. So I resigned that day, the last day of June, 1974. That same evening, there was a huge community event going on in the town of Barrhead, and there was a dance, and believe it or not, this is not a fairy tale, this is not make-believe, it's not me making up a story. At midnight, my wife and I were on the dance floor, and we ran into the Deputy Premier, Minister of Agriculture in the province of Alberta, Dr. Hugh Horner. And we stopped momentarily, and he looked at me and he said, have you ever thought about doing anything besides teaching? And I said, yes. He said, well, why don't you come work for me? And I said, sure. And then the crowd moved. And I went back to my place where I was sitting, and I kept saying to my wife, did we run into Dr. Horner? Did he offer me a job? Did I say yes? I really had been convinced that I'd had a couple too many, and this was leading to some strange stories. But no, I got up and I went and found him, and he said, I asked him if he had asked me to come and work for him, and he said yes. And did I agree? Yes. And then his next question was, why are you losing confidence? You don't want to do it now? I said, no, but don't you think we should talk about it? He said, absolutely. Get up in the morning and give me a call, and better yet, put the coffee on. I'll be there at 10 o'clock or 10:15. And the next morning I woke up, and I still didn't believe that I'd run into him, and I was unsure of it, but I didn't want to be embarrassed by him or embarrass him. So I phoned him, and he said, yes, I'm coming over, put the coffee on. So he came over, and within 30 minutes, everything was sorted out. My life was taking a new pattern. I was not going to Greece to write a spy thriller. I was not going to do anything else. I was on my way to his office, which I started in on August 1 of 1974. Your longevity as an executive assistant in a minister's office seemed to be finite. If you stayed there for 2 years to 3 years, you were doing pretty good. And I was there for my third year, and then I was getting tired, I was getting restless, and I had an opportunity. I was appointed as a deputy minister in the Department of Transportation and Regional Transportation Services. Turns out I was the youngest deputy minister in the history of Alberta with my appointment. And that then embarked in a whole new vogue for me. But remember, I had made my 5-year promise. So I was in the third year plus going on into this 5-year thing. And well, by the time the end of the 5th year came, I was now moving on again. Dr. Horner had decided after the election of 1979 that he wanted to move as well away from politics. So he, in every word, was my mentor, despite the fact he wasn't my minister when I became a deputy minister. Henry Kruger was. I used to meet with Dr. Horner periodically, quite frequently. So he said, well, if you're interested in seeking a nomination, now's the time, so get ready and go and do it. And so when he resigned from politics, October 1 of 1979, I went to Barrhead and sought the nomination. Fortunately, I won it by acclamation. And then I got involved in a very contentious election, my first election, the by-election of 1979. But won, and whoa, 8 more elections later. In many ways, it's a very frightening experience. And in many ways, if you're a young person, and I was only 33 years of age, going on 34 years of age, I had lots of experiences. I'd had my experiences in the minister's office going back to 1974, the deputy minister's office going back to 1977, and I had my previous teaching experience that I had from 1969 to 1974, and my university experiences, which were 6 years. So I had a lot of little experiences and what have you, but nothing prepares you for this, for getting up one morning and sending a letter to the Premier of the province of Alberta, because that's who a deputy minister resigned to, was the Premier, not his minister, Premier. And there was one other little interesting little niche issue. Of all the people in the public service, if you wanted to take a leave of absence to seek a nomination for a political party or seek an election, in all likelihood you would be given a leave of absence. And you might expect to be able to come back to your job if you were unsuccessful in your quest. However, there was one position that did not apply to, and that position was deputy minister. If you, as a deputy minister, made it publicly known that you wanted to seek a nomination, not having won the nomination, but having sought the nomination, you would have to resign. So here I was, with a young daughter, living in St. Albert, because that's where we were, and sending a letter to the Premier at about 11 o'clock in the morning and getting a note back about 11:30 saying that, well, I had to leave my car there because it was a government car, and oh, by the way, your health care and all your other benefit packages are canceled as of today. You're on your own. So, okay, I had to buy the car that same morning and afternoon. I had to make provision to get the health care benefits and all paid for. And then I drove home feeling as lonely as anybody would ever hope to be lonely. I was no longer a deputy minister with all the accoutrements, all the benefits that you had, all the staff that you had. I was on my own. That was pretty intimidating. Then when you consider one other thing, which was not a major factor, but it had been discussed with my wife and I, because it was going to be one of the most gut-wrenching decisions I would ever make in my life. I was making about $55,000 a year as a deputy minister in 1979. MLAs were being paid $12,000 a year in 1979. So if I ran and I was successful, I would move from my $55,000 a year salary to my $12,000 a year salary. I've never gambled that way in my life. And thank God that my wife at the time was totally supportive. She understood exactly who I was and what I wanted to do and why I wanted to do it, but it was an incredible gamble. I mean, if I was the same age as I am today, if I was 76 instead of 33, I don't think I'd have taken that gamble. But at age 33, okay, well, who knows what was going to happen. Once again, because of the experiences that I had, because I'd gone into a minister's office in 1974, I observed, attended cabinet meetings, caucus meetings over the next 5 years. I got to meet virtually every MLA in the province of Alberta, every minister in the province of Alberta. I had many conversations with them. I had a pretty good idea. Plus, with the fact in working in Hugh Horner's office, one of the things he wanted me to do was to help him in his constituency as his executive assistant. So he'd send me out to do all kinds of things and to meet all kinds of people and try and solve all kinds of problems. So I was really familiar. I was not lost with it when it came my turn to get elected in 1979, but I knew what I had to do. And first of all, you had to make sure you got to communicate with your constituents. Number one, you had to remember that they were your boss. And number three, was part of my mentor's advice, was that, you never say no. If somebody comes and sees you, they have a concern, they have a problem, they want some help, they need some help, you should be there to help them and to guide them. You can't solve every problem, but you darn well don't walk away from anybody and give them your back. You be there to help them. That was the best advice I ever had. So got into it and started writing a weekly column for the local papers, did a weekly column on the radio station, went to every event that I was invited to, if I could. You had to make some choices sometimes. If you were invited to two, as an example, anniversary parties on a Saturday afternoon, one was for 25th anniversary and one was for 50th anniversary, which one would you go to? Of course, you'd pick the 50th. That's the one you went to, because there was still time to do the 25th in the years to come if you were going to be there. Yeah, I revamped the whole constituency organization, had committee after committee, but just simply moved. And I started traveling. Although I lived 100 kilometers away from Edmonton, maybe a little more than 100 in Barhead, 60,000 kilometers a year. And that was close. I was not like the MLA for Peace River, who had to drive for 5 hours, or the MLA from Crow's Nest Pass, who would drive for 5 or 6 hours. Mine was an hour and a half. But even so, I started accumulating 60,000 kilometers a year. So think of it another way. If you traveled 60,000 kilometers a year, and if you averaged 100 kilometers an hour, which you could never do, it was always less than that, you're looking at 600 hours. Well, 600 hours, if you worked 50 hours a week, gave you 12 weeks. 12 weeks became 3 months. So that's what I would do in my car by myself, lonely, at night, sometimes in major snowstorms, sometimes in major rainstorms, sometimes passing moose on the highway and deer on the highway. But you did that, and I did that for 33 years, the equivalent, in my humble opinion, of 40 trips around the equator. Wasted time. Wasted because there was no way you could get around it. None. If you lived in Edmonton and you lived 2 miles away from the legislature building, you went home to your own bed. You came from out of town, you went to a hotel. I'm writing some books, and I've got a number of chapters on the travel one alone, and it's taken me 15 pages just to list the opportunities I had. But some were private, some were official. Let me just mention, in my humble opinion, the 3 most significant places that I've ever been to in my life. Of the 3, 2 were private, and 1 was on business. In 1968 or 1969, no, I think it's 1978 or 1979, I accompanied my minister, Dr. Hugh Horner, on a trip to Germany. He was going as the Deputy Premier of the province of Alberta to meet with the Deputy Premier of the state of Bavaria in southern Germany. And we were there for a number of days, and we were given the VIP treatment. Included in the VIP treatment was a holiday on a Monday in the state of Bavaria, and some cars pulled up at a hotel that we stayed at in Munich. And we got in these cars, and there were 5 of us, and there were 5 cars, 1 car for each one of us. So we hit the Autobahn on this holiday. And these cars were shooting 160, 170, 180, and the cars would be pulling over and what have you. But we ended up at a place called Birch's Garden. And there, we took some cars and wound up some really defying hair turns going up to an elevator that went into. And then we got in the elevator, we went up to the top, the elevator, some 470 or 480 feet, and it opened to a room. And it was the Kelstein, the Eagle's Nest, Hitler's private place on the top of the mountain. And it was in remarkable condition. The Nazi Party had built it for him years before. He had used it for everything from scaring every damn dictator that came to town to have lunch with him. And we were sitting there having dinner in his dining room, and I'm saying to myself, I'm the son of immigrants, basically. I'm of Polish heritage. And this SOB, whose dining room that I'm in today, being one of the most evil men in the history of the world, and I'm sitting here and I'm thinking it's only 33 years ago that he was killing people in the millions, and here I am sitting in that one. And to me, that left me a memory. Every time I ever went to Europe after that, I would always go visit a camp, a concentration camp. And I would cry, and I would have sleepless nights, and I would never ever believe that anybody should ever kill anyone. So I could never support capital punishment as a politician in Canada, nor could I support abortion on demand. And survived my years in politics. So that was number 1. Number 2, a private visit. In 1995 or 1996, after I had left cabinet and before I'd ever become the speaker, I was asked to lead a group of Canadians to Russia to speak about federalism. And this is only, 5 years after the demise of the Soviet Empire. And so here we're there. But before we get to where we're going to, in central Russia, we spent 3 days in Moscow. And I got to visit the Kremlin. Well, if you ever want to see a building of history and go through all the things that there are in the Kremlin, all the churches, all the little places where the royalty could go and have their own prayers, it was remarkable, because included in the Kremlin is a room that's about 30 feet by 30 feet, and it's loaded with diamonds. Russia being the largest producer of diamonds in the world, these were the crown jewels, so to speak. And they were there. There were lasers everywhere here that you couldn't get within 5 feet. You put your hand out there and the laser would get you, kind of thing. And that was quite remarkable. The third came on business. Later, when I was not a speaker, but I was a minister, and it was the trip that I had to Beijing, China. In Beijing, after you saw everything that you wanted to see, after you went to the Great Wall, after you saw the Ming tombs, after you saw this and you saw that, there was one last thing to see, and that was the Forbidden City. The most grandiose palace that I've ever seen ever in my history. It beats Versailles. And the day they were there was nobody there. Some years there are up to 19 to 20 million tourists a year that go to the Forbidden City. When we were there, it was ours. And we spent a whole day wandering around. And if you've ever seen the Last Emperor, the movie The Last Emperor, if you haven't seen it, you should see it. Then you get an idea what the Forbidden City is. But to be in that kind of an edifice and to see all the history associated with it and to recognize that 500 years, 600 years of Chinese history is embodied in this one building that has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of rooms associated with it, and to have an opportunity to go the way I was given an opportunity to go, it remained with me as one of those top 3 things that I'd ever seen. So I had been here for 5 years, and being in the Assembly as an executive assistant, I'd sit in one of the galleries, but I never had an opportunity to be on the floor of the Legislative Assembly. I'd been when it was closed, yes, but because you weren't elected, you couldn't get onto the floor of the Legislative Assembly. So when we, after the election, the by-election of 1979, we sat back here, I think it was February of 1980, and that afternoon at 3 o'clock is when the speech from the throne came down, was the first time that I'd ever entered the floor of the Legislative Assembly. And I was about as far away from the speaker's chair as you'd ever hope to get. I was the extreme left-hand corner because we had 75 out of 79 seats. We were everywhere, as the Conservatives were. And I'll never forget it because I said to me, this is more than a dream come true. It is the dream come true. As an example, there was a time when I became Speaker in 1997, and when you could not touch the water in the wading pools out front. Well, but every summer, all these little mummies and these little daddies would come with these little children, and they'd touch the water, but the rule was it's forbidden. You can't get into the water. Well, why can't they come to the water? If they wanted to go swimming in the water, let them swim. And wouldn't it be neat to have a hot dog stand someplace on the grounds of the legislative building, so if some mommy and daddy and their little children came to visit, that they could actually have something? And why couldn't they come onto the legislature floor? So starting that July 1, 6,000 people turned up. Incredible. And I hope all speakers have continued it since then. Well, first of all, as a member of the Legislative Assembly, it struck me as odd that people would work really hard to get elected. And then some of them, not all of them, I'd be very, very clear about this. Some of them thought that once they had been elected, that was it, that they had reached the top. And basically, they didn't have to work that much harder. That was a few of them. And I kind of disappointed in them when I got to meet them. As minister, I think the neatest thing about being a minister was the fact that you had to understand that you had to work together in a committee of equals. And if you thought that you were better than somebody else, or advanced over somebody else, or had more to say than somebody else, you quickly found out that your ego was going to come under attack. And you had better get with the fact that you were part of a collective, a cabinet, and you would work together and be together. Peter Lloyd, as an example, had the round table in government building, in government house, sorry. And it was round because he insisted that everybody was equal. And in a round table, nobody would be sitting at the head of the table. So when he decided that he should not be the premier for this discussion, he would leave his plate and he would move to another spot around the table. And everybody would know that he's simply now the MLA for Calgary, that constituency he represented, and he was not the premier. And that was pretty neat, because if you could work together collectively, you would not have a lot of problems. And we know as well that over the last decades in politics that governments usually get into trouble when they decide they're not going to work together harmoniously as a group. But if they work together harmoniously as a group, everything will be fine. Probably the neatest lesson I ever got as being deputy premier was the fact that you quickly found out after a period of time that the role that you played in the beginning, when you were considered a hot commodity, after a period of time would lessen, because all the people around the big guy, the premier, will quickly conclude that they'd been here long enough. Now they knew all the answers. They really didn't need the guy who was the deputy premier, because they, in fact, were making all the decisions for the premier. And that was a kind of an ego thing that kept you going pretty much for some period of time. But in the end, that's why there were some premiers that had deputy premiers and some premiers didn't have deputy premiers, just to make sure that all that would come into play. The best role that I ever had in my political life for 33 years to be Speaker of the Legislative Assembly of Alberta. It was something that I aspired to at the time. It's something that came my way. And I had a great opportunity to be here for 15 years. Some people will come for a couple of years, some people will come for 1 term, some for 2 terms, but in my case it was 15 years. And that gave me a tremendous opportunity to basically see a lot of things happen in a very positive way in the province of Alberta, including, I believe, an upgrading in the quality of the members in the Legislative Assembly of Alberta in terms of decorum and other things. By the time I became Speaker of the Legislative Assembly in 1997, I'd already been an elected person for 18 years, which is more years than most people are ever elected for. But it's 3 terms on average, not even 3 full terms on average in terms of longevity in the House. In my case, I had been there now for 5 elections plus. And I had the experiences. I had the experiences of a minister, I had the experiences of MLA, I had the experience of a committee chairman, I had the experience of government house leader, I had the experience of deputy premier. And people knew that I knew. And if they thought they were going to pull a fast one on me, all I had to do was remind them, I tried this 12 years ago. I tried this 17 years ago. I was through this. Here's what happened to me when they threw, punished me for being arrogant kind of thing. You're not going to win. You're not going to win because the Speaker always has the last word. And if you work with him, you'll find that he will respect you and respect you dramatically, and you will get farther ahead by working with him than trying to work against him. I really loved what I was doing. I really did. I remember coming to the building on August 1 of 1974 to work in a minister's office. And I remember the grandeur of the steps walking up into the building. I remember the entrance. I remember the rotunda that you saw. I remember the steps going up to the minister's office, going down the long hallway to his office and going into his office and seeing a little desk office about 10 feet by 10 feet in size and saying, oh, this can become mine for a period of time. Whoa, all this grandeur out there, and I get this. That was okay. But I loved it. I loved all of it. Yes, there were some disappointments along the way. There were some events that were stressful, but they weren't damaging to my personality or my psychic. They just set us back. As an example, one day we were having a heated debate in the Assembly, and it was in the early evening, and it was over a healthcare bill. And there were demonstrations on the grounds, and there were people yelling in the rotunda in the building, and the members were sitting in the House, and it was about, maybe 8:30, 8:45. And I'm in a chair, and I noticed in my right eye, straight up on my right, a man stood up. And I immediately jumped up, and I immediately told him to stop and desist, as it was. And I then directed that the gendarme come in and pick him up and take him out of there. And the reason I was so concerned is that in front of him, directly in front of him, was a child of about 6 or 7 years of age who was sitting with his, I presume, his papa. But this man who stood up, if he would have lunged forward, he would have pushed that little child over the railings onto the floor, and that little child potentially saw very severe damage to him. That was one of those moments that I basically said, ooh, this is kind of wild and this is kind of weird. I was not literally in the building 2 of the 3 shootings that occurred in the building. But I was in the building for the 3rd shooting. I was talking to a young man in the minister's office, and I was working as an executive assistant, and we heard bang, bang. He ran out of my little office, 30 feet to the hallway, turned right, ran down the hallway, and as he went down the hallway, another bang came, and a bullet came through the door on the left. It went into the door on the right, over the hallway. The minister in the door on the left was Horst Schmidt, Minister of Culture. The minister in the door on the left was Don Getty, the Minister of Energy at the time. And the young man, the bullet, of course, missed him, thank God. But the bullet holes remained in those doors for quite a few days. One bullet hole still remains in the Legislative Assembly of Alberta, and that's in the elevator. I remember coming in because the fellow who went shooting in the door, I think it was about 7 or 7:15 in the morning, if I recall correctly. I usually came in around 8 o'clock, so it had already been done and dealt with. You had the situation in Quebec where a gunman got into the Legislative Assembly of Quebec and actually occupied the Speaker's chair and was on camera with a gun pointing out. We never came that close to anything like that, but there were occasions in where security tended to be enhanced and reviewed and what have you. Periodically. I'm sure that it continues through to today. I think being involved in one of those, the largest construction project to the then history of Alberta, the Oldman River Dam, the size and the scope of the project was surpassed later by the Mackenzie Science Healthcare Center in downtown Edmonton. But to go through that, and to go through all the politics of that, and the environmental politics of that, and the regular politics of that, just kept you going. But what it was a godsend for Southern Alberta, because under our treaties that we have in Canada, Alberta must deliver to Saskatchewan 50% of the water that comes out of the Rocky Mountains. So if you don't store it, they don't get any water. But with dams, reservoirs, you could actually hold water back, and accomplish several things. First of all, you could reduce flooding in Southern Alberta. Secondly, you would have a ready water supply for the 50 some odd towns that could feed off of it. And thirdly, you were dealing with your contractual obligations to Saskatchewan. But do you think that as a minister, as a politician, you could ever convince the critics of that? No way. I mean, this was a lost cause from day one. That made it interesting but difficult. In terms of other kind of proudest accomplishments, I think the fact that this is not so much an accomplishment as a gift given to me. The Alexis Nakota Sioux First Nation made me an Indian chief, an honorary Indian chief. And of all the benefits that I've had and all the awards that have come my way, that was, to me, the most significant one of them all. They invited me to a big event they had in one of their community halls. And during the dancing and the drumming, a diminutive little elder, about 5 feet tall, came to me, took me by the hand, and she said, "Come with me." Took me to the edge of a fire and basically told me to bend over. So she whispered in my ear, and she gave me my name in their language. Chief Washiza Shadu Ushak Na. Now, it doesn't mean howling eagle. It doesn't mean disemboweled weasel. What it means, and this is when the tears started to come, it means white man with a kind heart. Now, for you to have an indigenous nation conclude in their minds that you've got a kind heart, told me something very dramatically about myself that day. I had never considered myself that kind of a person completely, but they viewed me as such. And I could never have been more proud of that. And that is the most significant accomplishment that's ever come my way in 33 years in politics. Previous colleague of mine, when he was speaker, stood up one day and basically denied an individual the right to speak in the French language in the Legislative Assembly of Alberta. And I was shocked. And so many of our colleagues in the House were shocked that day. And when I became Speaker, I made it very clear that any language can be spoken in this assembly. You don't need my permission. All I want you to do is provide a one-page translation of it so the other members will know exactly what you're saying. Now, the reason that was multifold. When I got elected in 1979, over 80% of the people who lived in Alberta had been born in Alberta. By the time I left in 2012, 55% of the people who lived in Alberta were born in Alberta. That's how much our population changed over those decades. We had tremendous immigration coming into this province because of the economic situation and the opportunities here and what have you. And as a result, so many people came from different parts of the world. And in the Legislative Assembly, the same thing applied. 54% of the members of the Legislative Assembly were born in Alberta. The rest all came from outside of Alberta. And 10 or 11 or 12 came from 10 different countries of the world. We were becoming very global. And that's why I like to send MLAs away on to attend conferences anywhere in the world. I thought it was a great benefit to the province of Alberta to get that knowledge and that experience. And thirdly, it was a very positive thing for the member himself to basically get to learn what the outside world was all about. They were talking a language that some of us didn't know. If you had been born in Alberta, and all of your members came from the one province, you're going to be pretty darn introspective. You're not going to have too much knowledge of the rest of the world. And this is not to be a demeaning statement to make for somebody else, but if you were to go to Quebec today, and you ask the members of the Quebec Legislative Assembly how many were born outside of Quebec, the answer may very much surprise you. Whereas if you came to Alberta and you asked that same question, your answer would be probably 54% were born in Alberta, 55% born in Alberta, and that would surprise everybody in Quebec. We're much more global. Look, this is a democracy, and in a democracy, people put forward their name to get elected, yes, but there's always usually a phrase that goes along with it, to serve, and to serve the public good. Not to serve yourself, unfortunately, there's the odd one that did along the way, but to serve the public good. So, okay, number one, you better be storefront. And when I say retail politics, that means you better have an office, and you better have a sign, and people should be able to find you. And you don't hide in the phone book. You have your name in the phone book with your number, that people can phone you at your home. And I used to have people phone me Christmas Day. Saddest thing in the world, because these people had nobody they could talk to on Christmas Day. And they would phone me and basically say, Ken, we're phoning you to wish you Merry Christmas to you and your family, but you knew darn well there was nobody else for them to talk to. It would take an hour or two to go through the list of it. I used to send out Christmas cards to every one of my constituents, 6,000 or 6 homes, or what have you. During the years, I went to visit this senior home or that senior home, this long-term care facility. Invariably, the only Christmas card or the only card of any type that they would have in their room was of me, from me, on their mantle. And that was very surprising for many people. But the fact of the matter is, there are a lot of pretty lonely people. So if you want to talk and believe that you're there to serve, you better really believe in the whole concept that they should be able to get a hold of you and you should be able to get a hold of them. And you better get out there and visit, and you better go and do all these events that you were invited to. And yes, I know you're tired, and yes, I know you haven't been home for a day, and yes, I know your children are saying, Daddy, Daddy, where are you and why aren't you here? Yes, I know all those things. And they can't be set aside. But by the same token, you've got to find more hours in the day to basically get to see the people who took you to the dance. You better dance with them. When I was an executive assistant at my minister, an outstanding person in his constituency who'd really helped him, had worked with him, was well known everywhere, passed away and the funeral was being held that afternoon, or an afternoon a certain day. Same token, he was scheduled to give a presentation to Cabinet. And it was not going to be postponed. It was going to happen. And he couldn't go to the funeral. And I saw him literally sit in his chair with tears rolling down his cheeks and saying, Ken, this is the worst that it gets in this business. And yes, that really hurts. When a fellow by the name of Milton, born with a tooth, publicly declared he was going to shoot me on sight, that had reverberations from my wife, and that had reverberations from my children in the small town of Barrhead. And one had to be careful, and one had to be cognizant of it. And over the years, there were many, many members who had threats against them that we'd had dealt with through the Sergeant at Arms or others to assist them and protect them. There were some very terrifying moments, and this was all before social media. Because some people are ill-educated, and some people are morose, and some people are just stupid, does not mean that the whole of society is anywhere like that. It's just simply too easy for people to hide behind a little gizmo machine. You're bent over, you can't even walk straight anymore, and you've got two thumbs going here, back and forth. And you can't communicate to anybody because you've never done anything for the last number of years but hit this little punch pad that you've got. I don't get up in the morning and have heartburn reading about somebody I know that I like and I know is an honest and good person, only to be attacked by somebody else who won't even identify who they are. I basically have no time for it. Maybe it's because I'm illiterate when it comes to technology, but I'm not wasting my time putting down other people and watching destruction and other forces. There's too much good in the world. There are too many good people, there are too many honest people, and there are too many uprighteous people who really want to get things done and can do it without denigrating somebody else. I still feel that it's still the highest calling there is and the most responsible job there is in our democracy, period. Well, it sure was tricky when you're sitting in the chair and the debate before the House is something that you know that your constituents are concerned about or may even be opposed to. How do you get involved in the debate? Well, you don't get involved in the debate directly. First of all, as Speaker, you're going to keep your mouth closed, you're going to keep your tongue within the mouth, and you're going to listen attentively. But it doesn't mean you can't send a private note to a minister sponsoring a bill or a minister advocating a certain policy or what have you. Do it privately, do it quietly, and it's surprising how much they will listen to you if you do it that way. So you can serve your constituents very, very well if you do it with the professionalism and the degree that's expected out of the Speaker. If you write letters in public criticizing the government, you're running a great risk. But not only for yourself, but more importantly for the prestige and the independence of the office of the Speaker, which must be protected at all times. You're always going to have the difference of opinions. And listen, if it's tough in Alberta with 87, think of what it is in London, England with 600, and they don't even have chairs for everybody to sit in if they want to come in at. So you have to use discretion. You have to use patience. You have to listen. And you have to be available for consultation if and when required. And you cannot be judgmental. Now, if somehow you can find yourself through that maze and do it, and add one more thing. The cheapest passport in the world is a smile. And if you can smile, it is amazing how disarming you have become and will be. On the first day that I stood in the chair of the Legislative Assembly, I had an opportunity to bring everybody together, be in the fold, by using the word order. I went through that first day without using the word order. Then I thought, that was pretty neat. So I went through the second day without using the word order. And then I said, I'm going to try this for a week and see what happens. I went through that week. I did not use the word order. 15 years later, I'd still not use the word order in the Legislative Assembly of the province of Alberta, and you will find no mention of order out of my mouth anywhere in 15 years of answered. I would wish them well. I would spend time with them telling them what they have to do in order to get elected. I mean, it's not this business of just saying, I'm going to put my name on a ballot and people are going to find out who I am. No, you're going to have to work. You're going to have to work your buns off. Every one of them has got to get out. If they're just sitting at home, hoping that somebody's going to recognize their name because they put up a few signs along the street, they're wrong. Where I live in the county of Parkland today, right now, there are 4 individuals running for the position of mayor, and 2 of them have now told me that they've visited over 5,000 homes in the last 2 months. Well, one of those 2 are going to win because they've done that kind of work. The ones who are just putting an advertisement in the paper and using their machine to send out messages, I don't think are going to be anywhere successful. So I encourage people to run. I think there's tremendous opportunity to run, but you better articulate the work effort more than anything else. You can have all the policies you want in the world, and they mean nothing unless you get elected. So you better focus on getting elected, and then if you get elected, you'll have the opportunity to advance the policies, rather than the vice versa, the other way around. It was a very significant and proud day in the history of Alberta. You're absolutely correct. It was the first monarch to address our assembly ever. A monarch had been in Edmonton before. A monarch had been to the legislature, but never in the legislature itself. Until I became speaker, there was one person who had been a stranger to the floor, and that was William Aberhart in 1935-36. When I left, I think we were up to 10. The 9 came when I was speaker, including Her Majesty the Queen. Well, she's a diminutive lady, tremendous aura of respect. It just oozes out of her. I mean, this is the most significant monarch in the history of the British people, and she will, without any doubt, when she reaches her next plateau, Platinum Jubilee, when she reaches that, that will be something unmatched, unparalleled, and just incredible. But it was a woman who basically said that she would be there to serve her people when she became the monarch. And she's kept her word. I mean, her son, who will become the king one day, it must be sitting saying, Mama, Mama, Mama. One of these days you might want to take a rest, kind of thing. But no, she kept to her word. She's done exactly what it is. She was the mainstay proponent of the Commonwealth. She kept it going more than any other leader in the British government, despite the fact that it was so important to the British nation. On the day she's here, we greet her outside. Then she goes up to the Lieutenant Governor's suite, and the Lieutenant Governor, of course, is not here because his protocol says he shouldn't be. So I go get her. So I knock on the door, and she says, please enter. Mm-hmm. And I come in, and she's sitting on one of the couches. The Lieutenant Governor's suite is akin to the Speaker's suite, pretty similar. So she's sitting there. So we have a nice little conversation for 3 minutes, 4 minutes or something, and then there's a rap on the door, and the Sergeant-at-Arms comes to get us, and she goes out first, and I follow, and then he leads us into the assembly. She gives her little speech, and then she gets out on the grounds, and she says hello. Before she gets into the grounds, she says hello to all of the pages. We're all lined up, and she took some time to say hello to them, and then she got out on the grounds, and she is a rock star. She was a rock star not only here in Edmonton on that day, but in the other events that were in the Edmonton area, and then when she flew to Calgary before going home, again, overflow crowds everywhere. And she is just a magnificent woman. We're so blessed to have in our presence, and there will be a lot of soul searching and sadness when the day comes for her to depart. Considering that she's British, they don't get carried away with a lot of speeches. So if you said, well done, chin up, she would probably relate to that as much as she would to 10 minutes of oratory. No, I enjoyed every minute of it. I've been a very lucky person, extremely lucky, in terms of the backgrounds that I've had, in terms of what I've been able to do and what I've not been able to do. There's one event and one thing that I did participate in before I ever got elected, But it's amazing how it's stayed with me, or people's knowledge of it has stayed with me through all of the years. When I was moved to Barrhead in my first career as an educator, I brought together a bunch of kids, and there was a television game called Reach for the Top at the time. And in Barrhead, Alberta, which was a very good school, but it was a rural school, we started to play this game called Reach for the Top. And it was filmed on CBC television. It was quite popular at the time. And we started playing in it, and we emerged as the Alberta champion. And then we went to Ottawa for the national champion, and we obliterated every other province in the country. And these group of 4 young students, 1 in grade 11 and 3 in grade 12 in Barrhead, Alberta, Canada, had now become the Reach for the Top champions. And that was one of those things that had nothing to do with politics. It had to do because you like to be a teacher, and you enjoy teaching, and you like working with young people and that sort of thing. It becomes one of those lasting memories of fulfillment that you have as an individual and as a person. And it's something you can say, well, that whole community rallied behind it, and that whole community still remembers it in the year 2021. One of the finest organizations that I ever had the privilege to be a part of and to lead was the Legislative Assembly of Alberta. And I've said this repeatedly, and I've written about it repeatedly, and I've told people around the world that when it comes to professionalism and the leadership that we had in the Alberta's Legislative Assembly of Alberta, going back to the day it was created in 1974, one of the things that Peter Lougheed did, along with the then Speaker Jeremy Amarangan, was to create the independence of it, and it has maintained itself. And I'm just so delighted that in the 15 years that I served as Speaker, not one government official, from the Premier to the Minister, ever told me that I should do a certain thing. All of them maintained and recognized the independence of the Legislative Assembly of Alberta. That's a credit to them as much as us.